Welcome everyone. This is the webinar for It Begins at 10, How Gender Expectations Shape Early Adolescence Around the World, Perspectives from Sub-Saharan Africa. I'm your moderator, Danielle Doman, and I'm the Policy Outreach Manager at African Population and Health Research Center, which is a Pan-African think tank based in Nairobi, Kenya. EPHRC is committed to generating an Africa-led and Africa-owned body of evidence to inform decision-making for effective and sustainable responses to the most critical challenges facing the continent. Our mandate is to generate and support the use of evidence for meaningful action to improve the lives of all Africans through three integrated programmatic divisions: research on health and well-being, research capacity strengthening to deepen the skills of African scholars working on the continent, and policy engagement and communications to support greater influence of evidence in policy and decision-making across Sub-Saharan Africa. APHRC is a proud partner of the Global Early Adolescence Study, which is an international study with the goal of understanding the factors in early adolescence that predispose young people to subsequent sexual health risks and promote healthy sexuality, so as to provide the information needed to promote sexual and reproductive well-being. Of course, we only have a short time today to take a peek into the results from 3 of the 15 countries that participated in this worldwide study. So we encourage you to peruse the October 2017 special issue of the Journal of Adolescent Health, which I'll be circulating the link to later in the webinar. Today's expert panelists are joining us from the US, Nigeria, Malawi, and here in Kenya. I'm happy to introduce them to you now. First, we welcome Robert Bloom, who's the director of the Global Early Adolescence Study, or we'll be using the acronym GEAS, which is the same. He's based at Johns Hopkins University. He's written over 300 journal articles, book chapters, and special reports. Bob is a consultant to the World Bank, UNICEF, and the United Nations Population Fund, where he recently authored the guidance on adolescent pregnancy, as well as the World Health Organization, where he has served on the technical advisory group of the Child and Adolescent Health Department. Bob joins us today from the US. Next, we have Bamidele Bello, who has a background in public health and nutrition with more than 5 years of professional experience in project management, organizational development. She's a research fellow with the Population and Reproductive Health Program at Obafemi Awolowo University in Nigeria. She's been involved in GEAS since the very beginning and is the field coordinator for the Nigeria site. Welcome, Dele. Then we'll hear from my colleague here at APHRC, Beatrice Mina. She's a research officer in population dynamics and sexual and reproductive health. She holds a Master of Arts degree in population studies from the University of Nairobi and is currently pursuing a PhD at the University of Witwatersrand, South Africa. Beatrice has extensive experience in social research, and she's the Nairobi, Kenya field coordinator for the study. Then we'll wrap up with William Stones in Malawi. Will is a UK-trained academic obstetrician gynecologist who has worked in Kenya and Malawi over the past decade as a clinical specialist, researcher, and teacher. He's based in the Public Health Department and Center for Reproductive Health at Malawi College of Medicine. Welcome to you, Will. Oh, and I should also say that he is the Blantyre site coordinator for GEAS in partnership with local primary schools. A warm welcome to all of our panelists, and very warm welcome to all of our participants who are representing 22 different countries around the world. So we're delighted to have you all, to have such an international engaged crowd today to share in the results. Just a quick note on logistics before we launch into the presentation, and that's we'll hear from, the plan is we'll hear from each of the 3 panelists before opening it up for discussion with all of the participants. However, participants are encouraged to register a question at any time using the GoToWebinar questions tool or the chat box, or by tweeting to @APHRC on Twitter. So any of those options are fine, and we will take those questions at the end. So at this time, I will turn it over to you, Bob, to please kick us off.
Thanks so much, Danielle. And it really is a tremendous, tremendous pleasure for me to be part of this webinar together with colleagues from Nairobi, Blantyre, and Ife. And one of the tremendous joys of doing this kind of work is to work with global colleagues who are just over the top terrific. So it's really fun to be able to share with you some of this work. So the Global Early Adolescence Study began in 2012. It has as its goal to understand the factors in early adolescence that hinder or support healthy development across a range of domains from early through middle adolescent years. Things such as sexual health, mental health, empowerment, school retention, with the goal of providing information needed for policymakers, program planners, providers, parents, and youth themselves. Next slide, please. So the goal here in the first phase was to undertake a set of activities. And the first phase was the past 5 years. One of the things that we did is that we published a systematic review on gender socialization among early adolescents, 10 to 14 years of age. This is looking at the global literature. It was published in 2016, last year, in PLOS 1. Our colleague from Karolinska in Stockholm, Anna Kageston, was the lead author on that. The second, and Danielle made reference to this, was the publication of a special edition of the Journal of Adolescent Health. And that came out last month, the October edition of the journal. Here, we had 7 papers written by teams of authors, and some of the findings will be presented today on this webinar, that looks at 2 generations, young people, 10 to 14, and their parents. And so we have dyads there of approximately 450 young people and an equal number of parents or guardians. We're also expanding this work, and there'll be some country-specific papers that'll be coming out, and also some Francophone papers coming out from Burkina Faso and DR Congo. We developed and piloted and validated a set of cross-cultural instruments for use among 10 to 14-year-olds. Specifically, next, one is the gender norms measure. There are measures that exist for older adolescents and young adults, but nothing in this age group. The second is a measure of gender equality that uses a series of vignettes and then asks a set of questions to understand how boys think about issues when boys are in the lead, when they're protagonists, and when girls are in the lead, and vice versa for girls' perspectives. And this is valuable for programming, for example, that's aimed at shifting and increasing gender equality. The third measure is a health instrument measure that's appropriate for early adolescence globally. This has 10 modules that are part of it. So it includes mental health, physical health, it includes parent and relationships, neighborhood, peers, schools, friendships. It includes ACEs, or adverse child experiences, and mental health, as well as sexual and reproductive health. And I would mention that all of the measures that we have developed are in the public domain. They are available on our website, geasstudy.org. They are available for people to use. There is no charge for them. What we would ask is let us know how you're using them, but we really want to put this out so it is widely available. Next, please. So what are some of the overarching takeaway messages from the qualitative work? And as I said, we'll look more closely within countries in a minute. One is that there is a universally endorsed myth, what's often referred to as the hegemonic myth. Boys are strong, girls are weak. Boys are dominant, girls need protection. Boys can be out there, girls need to stay home. And these messages are given to young people by everyone, by parents, by faith leaders, by teachers, by peers, by relatives, by everyone. And they all come to buy into this and believe it. A second thing that we saw across great cultural and geographic divides is that once girls go into puberty, they stop being seen as human beings and they start being seen as sexual beings. Girls post-puberty are sex incarnate, and the way people relate to them is all about their sexuality. Cover up. You can't look like that. You can't sit like that. You can't dress like that. Stop being friends with boys. Oh, we heard over and over again kids lamenting the fact of being having to give up friendships. Boys are trouble. Stay away from them. Don't go outside. Don't be too assertive if you're a girl. Be differential. So the consequence of all of these messages is that girls' opportunities are constrained. And with constraining their opportunities, their development is impaired, because we know that development is experience dependent. The less experience you have, the more delayed or retarded your development. And girls are socialized to be victims. So this is the first phase. Moving into the second phase, which is the longitudinal phase, we have a core set of 4 objectives. One is to understand how gender norms evolve during adolescence across very diverse cultural sites. The next objective, next please, is to explore how gender norms and gender equality influence health trajectories for boys and girls over time, and how these influences vary in different settings by context. Next, to explore how these processes vary by site, and finally, to examine how gender transformative interventions and sexual education impacts adolescent health through shifts in gender norms. Next. So this is sort of the key questions. We have 5 primary outcomes of interest in this work. One is mental health, and the primary mental health outcomes are depression and anxiety, because these are the predominant issues in early adolescence. The second is school retention and school completion. The third, gender-based and interpersonal violence. And the reason why we say both is because we know that girls are much more subjected to gender-based violence, but boys much more to interpersonal violence. And we're interested in both. Sexual health, which is sexual reproductive health, knowledge, awareness, utilization of contraception, sexual relationships, etc. And finally, healthy sexuality, body pride, pubertal satisfaction, in those dimensions. Next, please. So the next phase of our work, which we're launching right now in 10 sites, is a longitudinal design following a cohort of 10 to 14-year-olds up to 5 years and across 3 waves of data collection. In half the sites, there are interventions. In the DR Congo, in Malawi, Sud, Nairobi, Indonesia, all have interventions, and the others, next slide, thank you, are research sites. There are approximately 1,400 young people in each of the cohorts, in each of the sites. Next, please. So this is just a map that shows you the range of where the second phase of work is, where the first phase of work was, and where we're looking to develop additional collaborations. Next slide. And so we really see this as a global project. And over the next 5 years, a lot of the story will yet be told. Let me turn it back now to my colleagues to talk much more in depth about some of the important findings.
Thanks a lot, Bob, for that overview. I think you captured a lot of the key points and set it up really well for Dele, our colleague in Nigeria, to talk a little bit more in detail about some of the research that's come out of her sites. Dele, I turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. So I'm going to be talking about adolescent and parental reactions to puberty in Nigeria and Kenya. A cross-cultural and intergenerational comparison. So this was one of our main findings from the Kenyan and Nigerian sites, which was published in the Journal of Adolescent Health, as Bob has earlier mentioned. So it's well documented in the literature that adolescents have a wide range of reactions to puberty, which includes fear, anxiety, and increased demand for privacy, and also a demand for more responsibilities. Parents' reaction, on the other hand, is often influenced by how their adolescents react to their own pubertal reactions. Parental and adolescent reaction to puberty has a significant implication for their reproductive health. So the aim of this study was actually to assess how adolescents and their parents in urban poor settings from Nigeria and Kenya react to puberty, and then compare the experiences of these adolescents to the experiences of their parents when they were adolescents. And so data was collected from Nairobi and Kenya that I explained earlier. We have about 36 parent-child dyads in each of the country, and the interviews were conducted in English and in native languages of the two countries, and they were subjected to inductive thematic analysis, core coding, and then secondary coding. And so from the analysis, we realized that adolescents, they understand puberty as a hallmark for their development. When adolescents start developing breast, and for the male, when they start having cracked voice, that is what they tag as adolescents. So for the adolescents who have delayed in exhibition of these pubertal signs, they do not consider themselves as adolescents yet, even though they are within the age of adolescence. Another of their reaction was that there was increased demand for privacy. Adolescents who were before then as young children, they testify to the fact that their parents cared for them, or an older sibling cared for them, including giving them their baths, choosing clothes for them. But the moment they start developing secondary sexual characteristics, the most significant one for female, which was often referred to as the development of breast, they seem to hide these changes by asking their parents to give them some space. They do not want to bathe, their parents to give them their baths again, and then they do not want to bathe outside again. One important characteristic of the settings where this data was collected was that sanitary facilities, including bathrooms and toilets, were not sufficient, and children often most times have to bathe outside. But adolescents begin to refuse having their bath outside the moment they realize that they are having pubertal development. So this was a significant sign that was observed in the in these settings among the adolescents. They increase demand for privacy. For the male adolescents, however, especially in the cultural setting in Kenya, where they practice circumcision, their reaction to puberty was that of anxiety. They were anxious to get circumcised so that they can then see themselves as adolescents. So those adolescents that it seemed that their circumcision was being delayed for one reason or the other by their parents, they oftentimes have to confront their parents. When will I go to get caught? I need to go where others are going. Because what we observed was that there was like a rite of passage, and then the boys are taken somewhere, the circumcision is conducted, and they also undergo some sort of training. So when the parents seem to delay this for the adolescent male, they become anxious and confront their parents that they need to get caught. This was another significant reaction of adolescents to puberty for cultures that practice circumcision in Kenya. One other thing was the increased for responsibilities. Adolescents also signified that the moment they started growing breast, when they see themselves as adolescents, they started picking up some more roles in the house. For instance, the girls said that they help their mothers more in the house, and the boys help their fathers. So one significant thing that we observed was the gender differences in the responsibilities that they pick up. The female seems to be involved in the less strenuous activities, and that the activities that involve caring for people in the house. For instance, preparing meals, cleaning the house, washing of plates, while the males tend to be involved in cutting of grasses and fetching waters. These were responsibilities that seemed to require much more energy, that were energy intensive. So moving on to talk about the parental reaction. Parental reaction to their adolescents' puberty development was that of provision of their requirements, giving of sex education, and also counseling. Parents said that they provide for their adolescents reproductive needs. For instance, the most commonly mentioned one was the sanitary pad for the female. That around it's their responsibility to ensure that she has enough sanitary towel to be able to take care of her menstruation. That was one key responsibility that parents mentioned. One other thing was that they also saw it as their responsibility to train the adolescents on how to handle all these pubertal changes. Like when a girl starts menstruating, what do you do? Menstrual hygiene. How do you take care of yourself when you are menstruating? Parents reportedly mentioned that they do not want their daughters to get embarrassed outside when their clothes get stained with blood. And so they see it as their responsibilities to teach them on how to handle their development. Another main reaction of parents was that of sex education. This was more commonly mentioned among parents who were victims of teenage pregnancies themselves. They attributed that to the fact that their parents failed to give them sexuality education. And so they see it as their own responsibility to educate their adolescent girls so that they do not get pregnant as teenagers. One main thing that we observed in parental reaction to the adolescent pubertal development was that it was shifted more to the female child. Less responsibilities were mentioned for the male adolescent. Parents see it as more that if it comes to adolescents, we should focus on the female child. And this was observed in both settings. Now, comparing this reaction to the current day adolescents to that of their parents, parents mentioned that while they were adolescents, their parents failed to talk to them about their development. And this made most of them to fall victims of teenage pregnancies. And since that had happened to them, they do not want their own child to also have a baby as a teenager. I want to read this quote, which we can see on our screen, from one of the parents in Nairobi. It says, "During our time, we never had people to talk to us, unlike the adolescent girls of these days. They have parents who talk to them. During our time, my mother used to be so busy and she had no time to talk to me. I got my baby at 17 years old. I try to talk to my daughter so that she doesn't find herself in the same circumstances. This example, this is just one of the examples. We had this report from parents who, like I said earlier, were teenage mothers. One key important thing, however, in this was that we realized that the nature of the message they pass across seemed to vary, and it somehow shows the fact that parents themselves need to get the right education. One parent, for instance, mentioned that she engages fear tactics to stop her adolescents from sexual involvement. She says she tells them that the sperm, when it enters their womb, will eat up their womb and give them cancers. And she testified that this has worked for her over years, and she was not ready to stop them. So it's important the message they pass across to adolescents to be sure that they are true, and they give the adolescents correct information, because the time they get to know that they have been fed with lies, then they are likely to revolt. One other thing parents noted was that the influence of media, that in their own days, they did not have as much influx of media as adolescents have now. And so the adolescents these days have access to varied forms of information, including those that corrupt their sexual health. And this, they wished that there was a way they could curb it. Now, how does all this affect their sexual and reproductive health? Like I said earlier, information is now available these days for the adolescents. Next slide, please. Information is now available these days for the adolescents. So it's important that their parents understand the essence of passing correct information to their adolescents, and understanding how adolescents and parents react to puberty is important in order to build evidence-based programming to improve adolescent health and development. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. A really interesting perspective from the two sides, interesting comparison. And now I'm gonna, for more on the Nairobi specific, hand it over to my colleague here at APHRC, Beatrice Maina.
Okay, thank you very much, Danielle. So I'll talk more about the findings from Nairobi here in Kenya, and specifically about how young people learn to become men or women within their communities, and also the risks that are associated with such the perceived risks in early adolescence. So one of the aims of the very first phase of GAS was to look at the gender socialization processes, and here in Nairobi, what we found was that parents, and in particular both parents, media, and peers were main enforcers or reinforced gender norms. And for parents, both girls and boys indicated to have learned, or to learn mainly from their mothers, particularly, but also boys indicated to learn also from their fathers. And parents also influence the kind of activities that they engaged in within and also outside their home environments, including the kind of exposure they had to social norms, the gender stereotypes within and outside their community or settings. For the media, this happened outside their immediate family relations. Adolescents had access to both local, national, and international mainstream media, that is the radio and the television for girls. And for boys particularly, they had also access to movies, which they accessed either in their home environment or in kind of local theaters where they could gather and watch various different movies. This kind of access to media was seen to reinforce or sometimes to challenge some of the stereotypical gender norms through the kind of programming that they had. And this affected how these young people internalized the gendered roles, expectations, and especially how they behaved. For boys, specifically, while there were movies that they watched at home, like I said, parents express their fears for being unable to really control, especially what boys watched outside their home environment. And the fears they had mainly focused on their access, or boys being able to access some of the sexual contents or movies that had some, that were of sexual nature, like pornographic content, and they really felt they had no control over that. And these really had an effect on the sexual behaviors of the boys. But one thing to note was that in Nairobi, access to social media, and especially internet and Facebook, was really limited for this specific age group. For peers and for peers, we noted that they were also seen to expose adolescents to social norms and gender stereotypes, as they were expected, adolescents were expected to behave in a way that made them fit within their peer circles, including being excluded or included in activities such as games that were thought to be of specific gender, or to be engaged for by people of specific gender. So for boys, as we shall see a little bit later, they were viewed as strong, and hence they were given a bit of more freedom of mobility, while girls were protected and monitored at home. And boys, by the fact that they were being able to interact more with peer groups outside their home environment, it was very much critical for their gender socialization, that kind of interaction outside their home environment, and being away from any kind of protection or monitoring from their parents. Talking about the risks that are perceived risks in early adolescence, as we know, pubertal development sets early in early adolescence, and their changes, especially, and pubertal changes, especially for girls, was seen to mark the beginning of sexual and romantic interest. And this was particularly for girls. And from both parents and adolescents, this period of sexual development was viewed as very risky for girls. And as a result, girls were seen as vulnerable and in particular need of protection. And thus, one, their mobility was restricted as compared to boys. They were expected to be within the vicinity of their home, where a place where parents can see them or can monitor the kind of activities that they were engaging in. They were mainly accompanied while running some errands away from home, and they would be accompanied by maybe an elder sibling or a brother who had a role of protecting them from any risk outside the home environment. And again, as part of growing up, they were assigned roles that were mainly within their kind of home environment. This particularly for girls. Again, their social networks were closely monitored, and parents disapproved most of the relations, disapproved relations, even with female peers who were perceived to enforce some kind of bad behaviors, or who had some kind of questionable family backgrounds. Friendships with boys were also really discouraged or disapproved, and parents really expressed fear of they were fearful of the intent of boys in such friendships. And these included even boys whom they could earlier or in their childhood closely relate with or play with and engage with on a normal day basis. They were no longer allowed to engage with them the moment they transited to the adolescent stage. Again, romantic and sexual relations were completely discouraged, and they were termed as immoral, or in a common term that they used in the informal settlements, they were said to be bad manners. And like my colleague has just said, parents mainly used non-factual information to instill fear and hope that they would delay that onset of sexual or romantic relations in adolescence. And girls were mainly also given or told to have kind of a trade-off between engaging in such kind of relations, romantic relations, or continuing with your education. And failure to do that they faced some kind of repercussions where they were given a choice to drop out of school and continue engaging in such kind of relations or choose to continue with their education. Now, those were risks associated with girls. On the other hand, boys were socialized to face challenging situations in a manly way, that is, to be strong, to be seen as strong. And in this period, they were thought to get in a way where they can protect themselves from harm outside the home environment, and hence they needed no close monitoring as compared to girls. So in that case, their mobility was not really restricted, and there were no major household chores that could tie them or that could hold them to stay at home, and this exposed them to and gave them an interaction with non-familiar environments with little or no protection or supervision from their parents, which again exposed them to risks associated with crime, violence, and substance abuse. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, we realize that, we see that in this specific period of early adolescence, both girls and boys are exposed to risks, but they are exposed to different kinds of risks. And the period is viewed as risky in different ways for both boys and girls, where girls are exposed to negative sexual outcomes and boys to violence, crime, and drugs. Girls are viewed to be more vulnerable, and boys are viewed to be strong enough to be able to protect themselves. So this period, again, we are saying it shows, it represents a very unique window of opportunity to intervene before the norms are solidified, and parents and media play a huge role, or can play a very huge role to enforce, especially to enforce gender norms and to challenge the stereotypical gender norms, and they can be used as a great resource in that manner. And again, media in whichever form that is accessible to the adolescents, because we've seen they access different kinds of media, it's also an important resource that could be used to influence gender socialization processes through increasing knowledge about, and as well as challenging stereotypical gender norms with messages that are delivered made at population level and probably over time or over and over and over again. Thank you very much.
Thank you too, Beatrice. Will Stones and Malawi, I see that you've turned your mic on. Over to you, please.
Thanks very much, Danielle, and greetings to participants today. So I'm going to make some remarks about the Malawi site work, and this is still to some extent work in progress. Unlike our colleagues, we haven't yet published. We've made a number of presentations and got some very interesting feedback from some of the national stakeholders that we've been able to present the work to. So please take today's work as really a bit of an overview, and bear in mind that it's still work in progress. So it's worth commenting first of all on the context in Malawi, and we can see that the country, in common with other countries in the region, but perhaps especially so, does have an issue with early childbearing and early sexual debut resulting in adolescent pregnancy. And the numbers from the recent Malawi Demographic and Health Survey indicate that 4.5% of 15-year-olds have embarked on childbearing. In other words, they're either currently pregnant or have given birth, and that rises to 12.2% of 16-year-olds. And of course, that's given that a lot of programming is currently directed at really the 16+ age group. I think that's naturally a significant issue. So in the Malawi context, clearly moving the age frame back into the younger age group perhaps might take a particular priority, which is a driver for our interest in this work. So fertility in general in Malawi is now coming down, And again, from the demographic and health surveys, as illustrated there, we can see that, especially in the older age groups, age-specific fertility has really come down quite a lot, but really very little change in that 15 to 19 age group, which tends to suggest that our current interventions are perhaps need to be refocused. Next slide, please. Similarly, for HIV, the country generally is doing well in terms of rollout of antiretrovirals and progress in programming for prevention of HIV, with very good progress in terms of prevention of maternal to child transmission. But it's worth highlighting the issue for age ranges, in that the gender disparity, which is again common in the region, that it's predominantly a female predominant prevalence, that really becomes evident as we hit the 15 to 19 year age group. So before that age, that's not so evident, and that vulnerability in that 15 to 19 age group is very evident. When we started this work, some colleagues were really questioning, well, why would you want to work in urban settings in Malawi? Malawi is still predominantly a rural predominant country. So what's the issue around why are we working in Blantyre? Well, since these data came out a year or so ago, I think that question is not being asked anymore, in that it's clear that the urban setting is particularly a problem with regard to HIV risk. So again, really putting the emphasis on the need to identify ways of strengthening the resilience of young people earlier, perhaps than well before they may be entering sexual debut. So this slide summarizes the current state of our grouping, really, of issues that came out from our parent and child dyad interviews and other contextual factors. And I'm not going to go through them in detail, but I'll probably just pick out a couple of points that are really very important. One is really the school environment. So we have in Blantyre been working closely with local primary schools, and these are really very challenging places. For example, we work with Mbayani School, which is the largest school in Malawi, with a roll of 10,000 learners, which is really very challenging for the staff. But on the positive side, the school is where, especially in urban settings, most young people, most 10 to 14-year-olds are actually in school, and in fact the gender disparity in school dropout that's very much a feature of rural areas is less seen. So in fact girls are tending to stay in primary school longer, and the school dropout is not just gender related, but many other factors also affecting boys are there. But the fact that one can work with and engage with young people in this 10 to 14 age group in primary schools, we feel is a very positive thing. And although the school environment itself is quite difficult, it's still a good potential setting for useful interventions. We were surprised by the extent of exposure to pornography in these communities. That pornography is very widely available to young adolescents through local video showrooms for very low cost, and the people who run those showrooms seem to allow young people into them without too much restriction, which is something that's clearly a problem. There is quite a high awareness of the consequences of romantic relationships. Both parents and young adolescents are very aware of their peers, young adolescent peers, being pregnant and seeking abortions, seeking care for unintended pregnancy, and that's very much a feature. There's a lot of economic activity, and I encountered this the concept of parties. So this is young, might be a 12 or 13-year-old who needs some money for something, and she'll organize with her friends to have a bit of a party, and they'll get a sound system, and the person bringing the sound system doesn't mind waiting to be paid, and they'll collect money from people to attend the party. So that might be a nice, pleasant social occasion within the community, but we learned from our interactions with parents and children that these sometimes are occasions and events that can turn into places where girls are at risk and boys might be drawn into inappropriate behavior all too easily, and parents may not realize that their children are actually engaging in these activities. So on the aspects of gender norms and socialization, Malawi is a country that has very strong traditions of initiation for boys and girls in different communities, and it's interesting, in the urban setting, there's a kind of transition underway in that we find, for example, faith-based groups, church groups have organized alternative initiation activities for this age group, and we find within the content of those activities there is a bit of a spectrum. So there's a bit of a mix sometimes of what faith groups might regard as appropriate communication about appropriate behavior and norms, but that's often mixed with some hangovers from some of the traditional beliefs. So for example, in the case of girls, there's a tradition of teaching girls to stretch the labia as a preparation for sexual activity, and that is found, we came across that even among faith-based activities. There are other kinds of tradition still very prevalent, which can influence concerns, but also I think perhaps a particular feature of the urban setting is that the norms are not immutable. So for example, we've got some nice quotes from parents who are actually quite open to their sons, for example, doing what might be regarded as female activities such as cleaning, sweeping, and actually they're quite open to the idea, and it's not that some terrible sin has been committed. And so perhaps this is to some extent a feature of the urban setting, but it's a spectrum with perhaps a very traditional family living next door to a family who've made some quite big changes in their attitudes to gender norms. Next slide, please. Finally, this is a quote really illustrating, in a way, young people's aspirations. And I think when we talk about adolescent reproductive health, often the stories are all negative, and where it's all panic about teenage pregnancy and HIV risk. But I think we need to always remember that actually young people have aspirations and they express them very well. And this girl, what do you want to become after school, asks the interviewer. She replies, a lawyer. And who do you admire? I've forgotten the name, but when watching NBC TV, that's the Malawi Broadcasting Corporation television, I admire the one leading in Parliament. I want to become Madam Speaker. So I think it's really important that our work is able to capture aspirations and really build on that kind of interest and aspiration that there is among young people. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Many thanks, Will. Really interesting. I personally, I find it really fascinating to hear the direct quotes, especially from the young people, and to compare across the 3 different sites and see how things are different and how things are the same. We have about a little bit less, unfortunately, a little bit less than 10 minutes for any questions. And just to remind people that you can ask questions via the chat box or the questions function on the GoToWebinar platform, or you can tweet any questions to Twitter at APHRC using the hashtag GEAS. We've had a couple of questions for the presentation slides, and those will be made available through a recording that will be shared in the next day or two to all of the participants, so stay tuned for that. And we have a comment. I'm not sure who it's from, but the comment is, it's interesting that the Malawi team, as with the Nairobi team, found high exposure to pornography. In a separate study in Nairobi, similar results were reported for males in slums, and in many cases, this exposure was forced. Great to hear speakers' thoughts about what these results mean. And if the person who made that comment wants to identify themselves or in their country, would welcome that. But to speaker or presenters, did you capture the question and comment, and does anyone have any response?
Yeah, it's Will here. Thanks for that question. I think the reason why I think we were surprised in Blantyre is that the general access in Malawi to media and say, for example, smartphone penetration in poor communities is still quite limited, and I think Kenya, Nairobi in particular, is a very sort of switched on internet place, which is definitely not the case in Blantyre. But we realised that that pornography is penetrates extremely effectively, and especially the video, copied DVD kind of showroom type of places is the way it's being disseminated, and clearly this is presenting some generally negative, stereotypical sort of approaches to sexuality, which was really a surprise. So I think the message from that is really that that's something that we need to incorporate into interventions in a way to give young people a context. With if they are exposed to that kind of material, they need the context.
Thanks, Will. Anyone else want to respond to that?
Yeah, from Nairobi, I think our setting in Nairobi is, or the exposure the young people have in Nairobi is very similar to what they have in Malawi, in that one, this particular age group, 10 to 14, much as there is access to internet in Nairobi is more, or is rather huge, but for this particular group they have no really much access to internet or such into social media. But what came out was that just like in Malawi, they have those local video dens where they go to watch such kind of movies, which now parents are expressing fears that they could be accessing they could be exposed to pornographic materials there, and parents have no control over what they watch when they are outside the home environment. And this, just like Will has said, really has an effect on their sexual and reproductive health and the special behaviors, because the kind of content they're exposed to there, how a man should behave as a sexual being, if they come out, once they come out and practice the same, it has a huge impact on their sexual behaviors and again their sexual and reproductive health issues. So it's a huge concern, and I agree there are interventions that should start targeting such kind of issues and such kind of access to such materials and information. Thanks.
Thanks, Beatrice. Another comment from George at World Relief Malawi. He says, very interesting and informing. It's clear that parents can look after their adolescent girls in order for them to be well disciplined, as these are more vulnerable as compared to boys of the same age. Thanks, George, for your comment. We have time for this one last question from Cicely Mburu, who asks, there have been challenges, particularly when gaining access to schools to collect data. What challenges were faced in the different study sites? Dele, if you're still on the line, we'd love to hear from you first, if you faced any challenges and if you were working in school settings.
Yes, for the qualitative study, we actually went through the community directly. But while we were pilot testing the instruments, we use the school settings. And I would like to say that walking through the school settings in Nigeria, it's not difficult at all. So far you go through the appropriate channels and you obtain appropriate permission. If you have to walk in the schools, you obtain permission from the Ministry of Health, and then they have an association of principals. Once you have that, it's pretty easy. You just take the approvals together with the ethical approval that you have obtained for the study in general, and then most schools will allow you. What they are only particular about is they will want to see what questions you are asking, because sexual-based questions, if you have to do anything and you have to ask questions on sexual practices and what they do, such questions are usually frowned at, and you are not likely to get approval for such. But overall, it's pretty easy at working with adolescents through schools.
Thanks. Will, would you have anything to add to that, or would you generally agree?
Yes, indeed. In fact, we were really surprised because when we worked through the district education manager and the school heads, and we were actually dreading visiting our education colleagues and saying, look, we want to ask these really sensitive questions to your learners, and actually the response was completely favorable, and they're absolutely delighted, especially the heads and the teachers were delighted to have people asking or working with young people on these areas, and really supporting actually the life skills curriculum, which I don't think teachers find easy to deliver. And they were only too delighted to have people coming in and in a way raising these issues with their learners, and in a way tackling some of the things that they find very difficult as teachers.
Thanks, Will. Hopefully that addresses that question. I'm sorry to the people who questions are still in the queue that we didn't have an opportunity to get to. It's already 5 o'clock, but Bob, I just wanted to offer you the last word as the study PI, if there's any last comment you want to make before we close.
Thank you very much. I thought that the presentations and discussion were absolutely terrific. I would just simply say that one of the charges and goals of the GEAS are to put the issues of early adolescence on the global radar screen and on the radar screen of countries throughout Sub-Saharan Africa and around the world. These young people, particularly those growing up in very poor and economically disadvantaged communities, are insightful, they're smart, they have a lot of potential and possibility, but they also have a lot of exposures, both boys and girls, that unless we build safety nets, are going to continue to disadvantage them and their countries and the world. So we hope that the Global Early Adolescence Study is a step towards putting some of these issues more front and center on the radar screen. Thank you for your interest and for being part of the conversation.
Bob, thank you so much. Thank you to all of our presenters. I'm putting up the slide for the contacts for the websites for both the special issue of the Journal of Adolescence and where you can get more information on the study. Thank you all for your participation. And again, if you're interested in the audio recording, along with the slides, it'll be available and we'll send them out to all participants in the next couple of days. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.
Bye now.
Thank you.
Thank